In the middle of a rescue ranch filled with metal noise, engine fumes, and hurried footsteps, a blind baby elephant stood frozen, as if the whole world had disappeared around him. No one there knew how to pull him back from the fear swallowing every breath he took. Then a golden retriever with a small bell stepped into his life, not because anyone sent him, not because he carried some miracle, but because he brought a gentle sound the little elephant began waiting for every single morning. And when that bell suddenly went quiet, everyone finally understood the truth. The blind calf had never been holding on to the sound alone. He had been holding on to the friend who saved him from the dark. Before sunrise, the yard at Blue Cedar Wildlife Recovery Ranch looked half-built and half-abandoned. All steel rails, shadowed crates, and puddles drying into hard red earth. Floodlights hummed over a loading lane that smelled like diesel, rain, and wet hay. In the middle of it all, Micah stood, still, a small elephant calf facing a world he could not see. He was not still in the peaceful way sleeping animals were still. His body held a different kind of silence, rigid and listening, as if every muscle had been pulled tight around a single question. A transport crate waited 20 yards ahead. Men had rolled it into place before dawn. Its metal sides ticked softly as the night air warmed. Micah did not move toward it. Around him, people tried to stay calm. Eli Turner, the youngest handler on the morning crew, kept one hand low and open at his side, though he knew the gesture meant nothing to a blind calf. Nora Bell checked the latch on the crate twice, then once more. Somewhere near the supply shed, a chain struck a post and made Micah's ears flare wide like flags catching a sudden wind. His trunk lifted and swept through the air in short, searching arcs. He read the yard the only way he could, through scent, vibration, memory, and the pressure of sound against skin. None of it fit together. The ground beneath him felt wrong. Too much open space, too many fresh tracks, too many human voices trying to sound softer than they were. Even the morning birds seemed far away. Dr. Hannah Brooks stood back from the lane and watched the calf's weight shift from one forefoot to the other. It was a movement she knew well by then, the warning sign before fear hardened into refusal. "Don't pull him," she said quietly, not taking her eyes off Micah. "If he thinks we're pushing, we lose him." Nobody answered. No one needed to. They had all seen what panic could do to him. A truck door slammed on the far side of the yard. The sound cracked through the air like a gunshot. Micah jerked so hard his shoulder hit the side rail beside him. His trunk curled inward. His head came up high, ears stretched wide, chest tight with the effort of deciding whether to run, freeze, or fight a danger he could not locate. For one terrible second, it looked as if all of him might come apart at once. Eli took a breath to speak, maybe to use the low, steady voice that sometimes worked with frightened foals and orphaned antelope. Hannah stopped him with a glance. Human voices had never been the answer for Micah when fear got this deep. They gave shape to the air, but not safety. He needed something simpler than reassurance, something his body believed before his mind had time to resist it. Then, from somewhere behind him, a small brass bell rang once. It was not loud. In that noisy yard, it should have vanished beneath the scrape of boots, the clank of metal, the cough of an idling engine. But Micah heard it as if the sound had been dropped straight into the center of his fear. His ears snapped toward it. Every line in his body changed, not relaxed, not yet, but rearranged, pulled away from panic and toward recognition. The bell rang again, closer now, followed by the soft rhythm of paws crossing damp dirt. Eli turned first, Nora turned next, and just beyond the loading lane, moving with the easy confidence of a creature who had never learned to fear a room full of worried humans, came Benny, the golden retriever with the weathered leather collar and the little bell that always seemed too bright for such a dark hour. Micah did not step right away. He stood there trembling, listening with his whole body. The bell gave one more light note as Benny slowed near the rail. That sound did something no voice, no lead rope, no careful training session had managed to do. It cut through the confusion of machines and strangers and morning cold and gave the calf a single point in the chaos that did not feel like threat. Hannah felt it before she named it. This was why the crew had learned to stop talking when the dog came near. Benny never hurried Micah, never circled him, never pressed for attention. He simply arrived, warm and alive and predictable, carrying that small, clear sound like a promise. In a place made of change, Benny was the one thing that kept returning in the same shape. Micah took one step, red dirt pressed under his foot. The bell moved ahead of him, then paused. He took another. His trunk stretched forward, not reaching the crate, not yet, only following that familiar brightness through the cluttered air. The men by the truck went silent. Even the yard seemed to hold itself still, waiting to see whether trust could carry farther than fear. By the time the first edge of sunrise touched the roofs of blue Cedar, Micah had crossed only a few yards, but the moment felt larger than distance. He had chosen a direction in a world that usually arrived as fragments. Ahead of him, the bell gave a soft, patient ring, and for the first time that morning, the blind baby elephant did not seem lost in the noise. By full morning, the loading yard had settled back into motion, but Micah carried its noise inside him long after the moment passed. He stood in the recovery pen with dust drying on his legs, ears turning toward every distant sound. The bell was gone again. Without it, the world spread wide and uncertain, too large to trust, too broken to understand. Blue Cedar Wildlife Recovery Ranch sat at the edge of scrub country, where the land flattened into thorn grass and stone. Trucks came in from the reserve road at all hours, bringing animals torn by fences, floodwater, poachers, or pure bad luck. Micah had arrived 3 weeks earlier in the back of one of those trucks, small for his age and nearly silent. The men who found him had first mistaken him for a gray boulder in a patch of burned brush. He was standing alone in the heat with his head lowered, turning slowly in one direction and then another, as though the earth itself had lost its shape. Flies covered the wet wound near his eye. When the rangers moved closer, he did not run. He only swayed, already too exhausted to fear them properly. They guessed he had been separated from his herd after a dust storm rolled through the valley and broke everything into noise. By the time he was spotted again, one eye had already clouded over. Infection had worked its way deep behind the socket. The skin around it was swollen and hot. He had mud caked along his flank and a rope burn across one rear leg where he had caught himself in brush. Dr. Hannah Brooks met the truck at intake with Nora Bell beside her, and Eli carrying fluids no one was sure the calf would accept. Up close, Micah looked younger than the paperwork said. 8 months, maybe a little more, but reduced by hunger and fear into something smaller. His trunk kept lifting halfway and stopping there, as if every cent in the room ended before it made sense. They sedated him twice in the first 24 hours. The left eye was already beyond saving. The right still held a sliver of possibility, enough to make the team work longer than they should have, longer than exhaustion allowed. Hannah came out of surgery with blood on one sleeve and hope worn down to almost nothing. The infection had crossed too far. There would be no vision left to preserve. No one said the worst part out loud at first. It was one thing for an elephant calf to survive injury. It was another for him to survive a world he could no longer confirm. Vision was not his strongest sense. Hannah knew that. Elephants lived through vibration, scent, memory, and each other. But sight still closed the circle. Sight told the body when danger had truly passed. Micah woke into darkness that did not lift. At first, he seemed to wait for it to clear. He held still for long stretches, ears rotating slowly, trunk feeling the bedding, then the wall, then the floor again. When Nora changed the dressing on his face, he stood through it in a kind of stunned silence. By evening, that silence had turned brittle, like thin glass under pressure. The first time Eli entered alone with a feed pan, Micah heard the hinge before the young handler got 2 steps inside. His whole body reacted at once. He wheeled, hard, bumped the rail, then drove backward into the corner with enough force to rattle the posts. Hay burst upward around him. The pan hit the ground. Eli froze, helpless, while the calf trembled so badly the fence seemed to shake with him. After that, the pen was kept quiet, voices low, footsteps measured, metal buckets wrapped with cloth. None of it changed much. Micah refused food on some mornings and water on others. At night, he made a rough, broken sound that did not belong to anger or pain. It sounded more like a question pulled apart before it could become a call, the kind of sound that made the staff look at one another and then away. On the 5th night, a hyena laughed somewhere beyond the far boundary fence. The ranch dogs answered from the kennel run. Micah had been half asleep near the wall, but the sudden layering of sounds sent him surging upright. He swung his trunk wildly, lost footing on the straw, and scraped one side of his shoulder against the rail. By the time Hannah reached the pen, he was standing rigid, bleeding lightly, breathing too fast to settle. That was the night she stopped pretending patience alone would fix it. In the office, under the yellow lamp above the medical log, Hannah wrote longer than usual. Physical wounds stable, infection controlled, vision permanently lost, behavioral state worsening. Then, after a long pause, she added the line that mattered most. He does not need handling first. He needs something in the world that does not frighten him. The next morning, the ranch woke under a pale sky washed clean by distant rain. Micah stood in the center of the pen, not pressed to the corner this time, only listening. The air smelled different after weather, cooler, softer, less crowded with dust. From somewhere near the main house came the faint clatter of breakfast trays, a screen door, a burst of laughter, then quiet again. His ears followed each sound and let it go. Nothing in that morning promised change. Not the wet light on the fence rails, not the low murmur of workers crossing the yard, not the ordinary business of a place built to mend what it could. And yet, something had shifted, however slightly. Micah was still frightened, still blind, still stranded inside a world that arrived in fragments. But now the people around him had finally understood the truth. Force would not bring him back. Something gentler had to find him first. The next few mornings passed in the same fragile rhythm. Blue Cedar woke early, before the sun had fully claimed the yard, and Micah woke with it, standing in the hush between darkness and noise. He had begun to recognize the ranch by fragments now. The water truck grumbling near the cistern, canvas snapping in the wind, Nora's measured stride outside the pen. But recognition was not the same as comfort. He still startled at the wrong things. A bucket set down too hard, a gate latch thrown carelessly. Once, the sharp burst of laughter from two volunteers sent him backing into the hay wall so fast he split the twine around a bale and left straw scattered under his feet. He was learning the shape of the place, but not its mercy. Every sound still arrived with the possibility of harm attached to it. Claire Morrison noticed him before most people did. She handled transport paperwork and donation calls from a small office near the main house. But she had a habit of walking the grounds before breakfast with a mug of coffee gone lukewarm in her hand. She had known Benny longer than anyone at Blue Cedar and trusted him in the casual, unspoken way people trust creatures who have never once pretended to be anything but kind. Benny had come from Colorado the year before, after an emotional support program at a senior care facility folded when funding ran out. He was not dramatic, not brilliant in the polished working dog sense, and not especially obedient when anything interesting was happening 50 feet away. He simply liked being near frightened creatures. The ranch had kept the little brass bell on his collar for practical reasons. Benny wondered. The bell was a small thing, warm-colored and worn smooth where the leather cord rubbed against it. It had been donated in a box of livestock supplies no one remembered ordering. On horses, it would have sounded old-fashioned. On Benny, it sounded oddly bright, a clean note that carried just enough to mark where he was without feeling sharp. Most days, the staff stopped hearing it after an hour. Micah never did. That morning, Eli had left the side gate half-latched while hauling a sack of feed to the antelope enclosure. He would later swear it had caught properly. Maybe it had, for a second. Maybe the wood had swollen from the damp night air and shifted just enough to leave a gap. Whatever the reason, Benny nosed the gate with that mild, practical curiosity of his, and the latch gave way without protest. Micah heard the hinge before anyone else noticed. His ears snapped forward. His trunk lifted into the cool air, testing it. Then came the softer sound. 4 quick paws against packed dirt, too light for a person, too steady for a bird or monkey. He froze where he stood. Fear had trained his body to expect the worst from every new approach. But beneath the footsteps came something else, something clear and small and strangely alive. The bell rang once. It was not loud enough to startle him. It floated through the pen like a drop of water falling into stillness. Micah's trembling eased so suddenly it was almost visible. His ears held still instead of sweeping. For the first time since arriving at Blue Cedar, he did not retreat from an unfamiliar sound. He remained exactly where he was, every part of him leaning toward it as if the note had touched some place fear had not reached. Benny stepped farther inside and stopped a few yards away. He did not bark. He did not bound forward the way some dogs would have, eager and foolish and too full of themselves to read the atmosphere. He only stood there for a moment, tail moving once, then twice, before folding neatly onto the dirt. The bell chimed softly as he settled, then fell quiet. The pen seemed to draw in around that silence. Outside the rail, Claire reached the open gate and saw what had happened. Eli came up behind her, ready to apologize, ready to go in and get the dog out before Hannah saw. Claire put one hand out across his chest without looking at him. "Not yet," she whispered. Something in the scene had already gone past accident and into importance. Even Eli, who had spent weeks bracing for Micah's next panic, felt it. Micah took no step at first. He only listened. He could hear Benny breathing, the subtle shift of fur against dust, the tiny metallic click as the bell moved with each small turn of the dog's neck. None of it carried threat. None of it rushed him. The calf's trunk lifted higher, reading warmth, hide, leather, sun-damp air, and the living scent of an animal. That did not seem to want anything from him. Then, with terrible caution, he moved. One step. Stop. Listen. Another step, lighter than anyone thought a young elephant could place a foot. He did not angle toward the fence or the corner, where he usually sought pressure against his side. He moved into the open center of the pen, toward the little sound that had entered his fear, and somehow failed to make it worse. Benny remained where he was, patient in the unstudied way only animals can be. By the time Dr. Hannah Brooks arrived, called in a low voice from the path, Micah had come close enough for his breath to stir the fur along Benny's shoulder. His trunk hovered in the space between them, not touching, not yet. Hannah stopped at the rail and did not speak. Claire stood beside her. Eli held the feed sack against his chest like something forgotten. No one in that yard seemed willing to risk a single, unnecessary sound. Micah's trunk stretched forward another inch, then another. It found not the bell first, but the warmth beneath it, the rise and fall of Benny's ribs, the shape of a shoulder, the simple fact of another living body at rest. He touched the dog so lightly it could have been mistaken for air. Benny did not move away. The bell gave one soft note, and in that brief, shining sound, something in the blind baby elephant began to change. The next morning, Micah was awake before the yard found its voice. Dawn had not yet lifted the dark from the acacia line, and the recovery pen still held the cool breath of night. He stood near the center this time, not pressed into the corner, not braced against the rail. His ears moved slowly through the quiet, searching for one sound, and one sound only. At Blue Cedar, mornings usually unfolded in layers. First came the generators in the far shed, then the cough of trucks, then kitchen doors, boots on gravel, pails, voices, dogs. To Micah, it had all once felt like a storm that never fully passed. But now, there was a pause before the day truly began, a narrow space in the dark where the world seemed to hold itself still. In that pause, he waited. Then the bell came, a single, bright note from beyond the side gate, followed by the soft rhythm of paws on damp ground. Micah's ears lifted forward so quickly it seemed instinctive, older than fear and stronger than thought. He did not flinch. He did not turn away. He simply faced the sound as Benny entered the pen, carrying with him that same small certainty he had brought the day before. Claire noticed the time because she happened to glance at the old watch strapped to her wrist. 7:14. The next day, it happened again. And the day after that, too. Benny had no training for this, no command that sent him there, no schedule anyone had imposed. Yet every morning, as if obeying a clock hidden somewhere in his bones, he appeared at Micah's gate at exactly 7:14. The staff began speaking of it quietly, with the caution people use around fragile things. They Do not want to break by naming too loudly. Hannah wrote it in the log. Eli circled it twice in blue pen. 7:14 became more than a time. It became a threshold. Before it, Micah was restless and uncertain, listening for danger in every creak of the ranch. After it, the shape of his body changed. On the fourth morning, Benny crossed halfway into the pen and lay down near the shade line. Micah stood still for nearly a minute, sorting the air. Then he walked over and stopped within a yard of the dog. It was the closest he had willingly placed himself beside any living creature since arriving at Blue Cedar. His trunk drifted forward, touched Benny's flank, and withdrew again, as if testing whether calm could be real twice. On the fifth morning, he did not pull back so quickly. He touched Benny's shoulder, then the leather collar, then the bell itself. The brass was cool in the dawn air. It swung lightly against his trunk and gave a tiny ringing note. Micah did not startle. He held there a second longer, reading the shape of the object, the warmth of the fur beneath it, the slow, steady breathing of the dog who wore it without any effort at all. For the first time, Eli brought feed while Benny was still in the pen. He moved carefully, boots softened by the dirt, breath held without meaning to. Micah heard him, stiffened for an instant, then turned back toward the bell. It was not trust exactly. Not yet. But it was a choice, and that choice startled the humans more than any sudden miracle could have. The calf lowered his trunk and took a mouthful of hay. Hannah began adjusting the morning routine around what she was seeing. No rush of handlers at sunrise. No metal dragged across concrete near Micah's pen. Benny first, then food. Benny first, then water. Benny first, and only then anything the people needed to do. It felt absurd to structure care around a golden retriever who had once been dismissed as too distractible for formal work. Yet the results were impossible to ignore. Still, Hannah did not let herself romanticize it. She needed to understand what Micah was actually following. Was it the bell? The sound pattern? The dog's body heat? The scent? On the 8th morning, after Benny wandered off toward the kitchen, she asked Eli to hang a similar brass bell from a fence post inside the pen. Then they stood back and waited in silence. Micah heard it almost immediately. He approached in the same slow, attentive way, trunk raised, ears forward, steps measured. For one suspended moment, Hannah thought the answer might be simple. The calf came within inches of the hanging bell. It stirred faintly in the breeze and rang once. Micah stopped. He remained there, listening, but something in his body did not soften. The sound was right. The feeling was wrong. He reached out and touched the post. Dry wood, still air, metal without breath, no warmth beneath it, no living shape attached to the sound. After several long seconds, he lowered his trunk and turned away. Not frightened, not confused, just unconvinced. He crossed back toward the far side of the pen and stood there, waiting in a silence so clear it made the whole test feel foolish. When Benny returned minutes later, trotting in from the yard with dust on his paws and sunlight beginning to catch along his coat, the bell at his collar gave that same clean, bright note. Micah's entire body answered before anyone moved. His ears lifted, his head angled toward the sound. He walked directly to the dog and stopped beside him, calmer than he had been all morning. Hannah looked down at her notes and underlined a single sentence. It wasn't the bell alone. That realization changed the shape of the work ahead. The sound mattered, yes, but only because it belonged to something alive, something consistent, something that had entered Micah's darkness without asking anything from him. At 7:14 each morning, the calf was not finding an object to follow. He was finding a presence. And, in a world still broken into fragments, that presence was beginning to feel like the first whole thing. By the second week, Blue Cedar had begun to organize itself around a ritual no one had planned. Before the first feed cart rolled out, before the generators fully woke the yard, Micah listened for the bell. At 7:14, Benny would appear, and the calf's whole body would ease by degrees too small to notice unless you had watched fear live inside him for days. What changed was not dramatic at first. Micah still startled at sharp metal sounds. He still froze when strangers passed too close to the rail. But now he recovered faster. Instead of backing himself into a corner and staying there, he would turn toward the bell and wait. The waiting itself was new. It meant some part of him had begun to believe relief might come from outside his own panic. Hannah noticed that Micah was beginning to map the pen around Benny's movements. If the dog settled in the shade, Micah drifted closer to the shade. If Benny crossed the open patch near the trough, Micah followed later, cautiously, as if testing whether the ground had become safer simply because the dog had occupied it first. It was no longer just comfort. It was orientation. So they tried something careful. One morning, Eli entered with Benny already inside and walked a slow arc toward the center of the pen, keeping his distance, carrying nothing that clanged or scraped. Benny rose and wandered after him. The bell marked each step with a small, bright rhythm. Micah stood listening, trunk lifted, his weight shifting forward and back with the effort of deciding. Then he moved. He followed the bell 3 paces before stopping. It did not look like much to anyone who had not seen his first days at Blue Cedar, but Hannah felt the air leave her chest anyway. Those 3 paces were taken across open ground he had avoided since arrival. No fence at his shoulder, no hay bale pressed to his side, just dirt, light, and the uncertain trust that maybe the sound ahead of him belonged to safety. The next day they tried again, this time with a low branch laid across the dirt. Benny stepped over it without thought, the bell giving a faint double note as his shoulders rose and fell. Micah heard the change and stopped short. He reached forward with his trunk, found bark, dry leaves, the shape of the obstacle, and stood there for nearly a minute. Then, slowly, with all the care of a creature inventing courage from scratch, he stepped over. Eli grinned so hard his face hurt, but he said nothing. At Blue Cedar, they were learning that too much human emotion could crowd a fragile moment. Hannah simply wrote in the log, with the calm hand of someone trying not to disturb her own hope. Following behavior, increasin'. Open space tolerance improved. Uses auditory anchor to assess obstacle transitions. The language was clinical. The truth felt almost holy. A shallow water pan came next, wide enough to alter the sound, under Benny's paws. The bell seemed flatter crossing over it, softened by the damp echo. Micah noticed immediately. He reached the edge, stopped, and placed the tip of his trunk into the water. For a few seconds, he only explored. Coolness, depth, the small ripple returning to him. Then one 4-foot entered, then the next. He crossed without panic and stood on the far side, breathing hard but steady. That afternoon, Claire sat on an overturned bucket near the office porch and watched Benny asleep in a stripe of sun. "He doesn't know he's doing any of this," she said. Hannah, beside her, kept her eyes on Micah in the distance. "That may be why it works," she answered. Benny offered no performance, no demand, no lesson. He was simply consistent. For an animal whose world had shattered, consistency was beginning to feel like mercy. But progress was never clean for long. On the 9th night, clouds rolled in from the south, thick and low, carrying heat and a pressure the ranch dogs felt before the humans did. By dusk, the air had turned electric. Canvas snapped hard against its ropes. The birds disappeared into the thorn trees. Micah sensed the change before the first thunder arrived. He stood rigid in the pen, trunk lifted, reading a sky he could not see. The storm broke all at once. Rain slammed the tin roofs. Wind drove dust under the eaves in hot, stinging waves. A transformer popped near the generator shed, and the backup system kicked in with a violent metallic shudder that tore through the yard like a scream. The antelope in quarantine began crashing against their gates. Somewhere to the west, one of the older zebras kicked the wall of its enclosure over and over in blind alarm. Micah came apart in seconds. He spun toward the rail, then away from it, trunk curled tight, ears wide, feet striking the ground so hard the vibration carried to the walkway. He hit one post with his shoulder, recoiled, then wheeled again as if the storm were inside the pen with him. Eli took one step forward, but Hannah caught his arm. "Not now," she said, though her own voice sounded thin against the rain. "If we rush him, he'll fight what he can't find." Then, through thunder and metal and the wild shaking of the yard, another sound slipped in. A bell. Small, bright, steady. Claire had opened the side run before anyone told her to. Benny came in low and quick, fur already wet, head down against the wind. He did not bark. He did not dart around Micah's legs or startle at the chaos. He moved only far enough into the pen to be heard, the bell ringing once, then once more as he stopped and stood his ground in the center of all that noise. Micah did not calm at once. His body still shook with terror. His breath still came fast. And for one awful moment, Hannah thought the storm had pushed him too far beyond anything a familiar sound could reach. Then the calf paused, just for a heartbeat. His ears locked forward. His head turned. In the wreck of thunder and fear, he had found one note he knew, and he chose to listen. For a long second, no one at Blue Cedar moved. Rain hammered the roofs. Wind shoved water sideways through the rails. Somewhere beyond the medical shed, a loose sheet of tin banged again and again like a struck drum. But inside Micah's pen, the calf had gone from wild motion to a trembling stillness. Every line of his body pulled toward the soft ringing at the center of the storm. Benny stood with his paws planted wide in the mud, soaked through, tail low, collar dark with rain. He looked smaller than he usually did in the daylight, less like a cheerful ranch dog, and more like something stubbornly gentle refusing to leave its place. The bell moved when he breathed. That was all. No command, no trick. Just one living creature staying where fear could find him. Micah's trunk lifted high, then wavered. The storm still owned his nerves. Thunder rolled low across the valley and made the fence tremble under his flank. He flinched, but he did not spin away this time. Instead, he stayed angled toward Benny, as if the dog had become the only fixed object in a world suddenly breaking apart. His breathing was harsh, his feet shifted, but he held. Hannah knew better than to rush what was happening. She stood under the overhang with rain dripping from the edge of her jacket and kept one hand braced against the post. Eli was beside her, soaked from the knees down, looking as though every muscle in him wanted to run into the pen and do something useful. "Let him choose it," Hannah said, barely above a whisper. "He has to choose it." Another flash split the sky. A heartbeat later, thunder cracked directly overhead. Micah jerked so violently his front foot slid in the mud, and for an instant, the old panic surged back through him. His trunk curled inward. His ears flared wide. Then Benny took 3 slow steps forward. The bell answered each one with a small, clear note. So fragile. Against the storm it should have disappeared, yet somehow it reached him again. Micah lowered his head. It was not surrender. It was concentration, the fierce effort of an animal trying to separate one true sound from 1,000 false ones. He took a step. Mud sucked at his foot. He paused. Benny did not close the distance any further. He only waited, rain running off his muzzle, the bell quiet now except for the little movement of breath. Micah took another step, then another. By the time he reached Benny, the calf was still shaking, but not from blind terror anymore. His trunk stretched forward through the rain and found wet fur, the leather collar, the cool round metal of the bell. He touched it, as though checking that it remained real under all that thunder. Benny stood where he was, head lowered, eyes half closed against the weather. The pen seemed to gather around the two of them. Then Micah did something none of them had seen before. Instead of retreating after contact, he stayed. He folded the end of his trunk loosely over Benny's shoulder and held it there, not gripping, not searching, just keeping contact while the storm spent itself around them. The gesture was so quiet and so deliberate that Claire, watching from the walkway, had to press a hand to her mouth before any sound escaped her. The worst of the rain passed within 20 minutes, though the valley still muttered with distant thunder. Water dripped from the rails. The antelope had gone still. The zebra in quarantine had stopped kicking. In the middle of the churned pen, Micah remained beside Benny with his ears half lifted, his body no longer braced for impact. He looked exhausted, but anchored, as if some new part of his world had just held under pressure. That night, Hannah wrote later than usual. Storm exposure produced severe behavioral escalation, interrupted by canine intervention at 2016. Subject regained regulation through voluntary auditory and tactile orientation. She stared at the final line before adding something she would not have written a week earlier. Bond may now function under acute stress, not only routine contact. Even in clinical language, the sentence felt larger than the page that held it. The next 3 mornings were quieter, washed clean by the storm front that moved east and left the ranch under a pale blue sky. Micah seemed changed by something harder to measure than progress. He still turned sharply at harsh sounds, still hesitated near gates and open ground. But fear no longer claimed all of him at once. When he startled, he searched. And when he searched for Benny. Hannah decided the time had come to stretch that trust a little farther. In the larger training paddock beyond the recovery pens, the ground sloped toward a shallow drainage cut and rose again under a stand of thorn trees. It was unfamiliar terrain for Micah, rougher and less contained than the space he knew. Eli worried it was too much, too soon. Hannah worried he might be right. Still, the calf was going to need a larger map eventually. So just after 7:14, with the morning still cool and Benny already padding ahead with the bell marking his easy progress, they opened the inner gate and let Micah step into the wider paddock for the first time. He stopped almost immediately. The space was too open, the air too broad, the earth carrying too many new scents at once. For a few seconds, he stood there, small in all that distance, listening for reasons to turn back. Then Benny moved ahead, and the bell rang once in the clear morning light. Micah's ears came forward, his trunk lifted, slowly, carefully, as if carrying the memory of last night's storm inside him, but not letting it rule him. He stepped through the gate and followed the sound into the larger world. By late dry season, Micah no longer moved through blue cedar like a calf waiting for impact. He still could not see, and the world still reached him in fragments. Wind, scent, footfall, vibration. But those fragments no longer felt random. The ranch had become legible under his feet. He knew the softer patch near the trough, the warm dust by the west rail, the hour the bell would come. He had grown heavier, too, his shoulders filling out, his trunk gaining that quiet precision elephants seem born with, but still must earn. When Benny entered the pen at 7:14, Micah no longer rushed or froze. He simply turned toward him with the settled confidence of habit. What had once saved him in pieces was now built into the shape of his mornings, and everyone at Blue Cedar had begun to live around it. The decision came on a Wednesday under a white noon sky. Hannah called the senior staff into the office and laid out the transfer papers from Red Hollow Elephant Conservancy. Micah had reached the point they had always hoped for: stable, adaptive, ready for a managed herd environment. No one argued with the logic. That was the cruelty of it. The right decision and the painful one were, for once, exactly the same. Eli took the news badly, though he tried not to show it. He stood outside Micah's pen that afternoon, with a rake in one hand, and watched the calf orient toward Benny's bell from 50 feet away. Claire came up beside him and said nothing for a while. "He can't stay here forever," she said at last. Eli nodded. "I know." But knowing a thing with your mind did not stop your chest from tightening when your heart heard it. The next morning brought the first sign that Micah understood more than anyone had wanted to believe. Eli arrived early and found half the loose hay bales shifted from their usual places. A rubber mat from the shade side had been dragged several feet across the dirt. 2 light feeder logs had been nudged into a rough curve. All of it had been arranged around the patch where Benny usually lay after 7:14. Nothing was damaged. Nothing looked frantic. The arrangement was careful, almost architectural in its own strange way, as if Micah had worked through the night to redraw the pen around the dog's resting place. Eli stood at the rail without moving, the rake loose in his hand, and felt a slow ache spread through him. By the time Hannah joined him, neither of them had found words that seemed equal to what they were seeing. Hannah photographed the layout before anyone touched it. Not for records, not exactly. More because she knew some moments became harder to trust later, unless there was proof they had truly happened. The behavioral literature had language for attachment, regulation, proximity seeking. It had very little to say about a blind young elephant dragging the world into a protective shape around a sleeping dog. She left everything where Micah had placed it. Word moved quietly through the ranch. Nora came by and stared at the hay ark with her arms folded tight. Claire stood with her coffee gone cold again, eyes fixed on Benny, who seemed cheerfully unaware that anyone had built a monument to his daily nap. Micah remained nearby, not anxious, not defensive, only attentive. When Benny settled into the center of the curved arrangement, the calf stepped closer and stood watch beside him. The transfer was set for 2 mornings later. Blue Cedar did not become sentimental out loud. There were crates to check, sedation contingencies to review, veterinary packets to copy, route maps to confirm. Hannah moved through each task with the clean precision of a person protecting herself with competence. Yet every time the bell sounded from Micah's pen, conversation thinned. People listened whether they meant to or not. On the final morning, dawn came soft and cool, the kind of East African sunrise that does not announce itself so much as reveal what had been there all along. Micah was already waiting near the center of the pen. He was not restless. If anything, he seemed more still than usual, as though he had gathered himself around the expectation of one familiar thing before the day asked everything else of him. At 7:14, Benny came through the gate. The bell rang once, then again, as he crossed the dirt in an easy circle along the inside perimeter. Micah turned and followed, not at his usual measured distance now, but close enough that the tip of his trunk occasionally brushed Benny's flank, close enough that each small shift of the dog's gait translated directly through sound and warmth into the elephant's body. No handlers entered. No one interrupted the circuit. They walked the pen once, then again. Benny finally chose his usual patch of ground near the hay ark and lay down with a soft grunt, the bell chiming as he settled. For a moment, Micah remained standing over him, ears half lifted, trunk suspended above the small brass shape at Benny's throat. Then, with the same deliberate care he brought to every brave thing, he folded himself down beside the dog, not a yard away, not even a careful half-step away. Beside him, Micah's side rested, within inches of Benny's golden flank, the bell hanging still in the narrow strip of warm air between them. Along the fence, 3 staff members stood in complete silence. No one reached for a pen. No one trusted themselves to narrate what the morning had become. For the first time since arriving at Blue Cedar, Micah was not just following safety. He was resting in it. By 10 o'clock, the crate stood in the loading lane with both doors open, its metal floor dusted in fresh straw and the side vents throwing narrow bars of light across the interior. The ranch had grown quieter in that strange, respectful way places sometimes do, before something hard and necessary. Micah stood at the gate of his pen, ears turning, trunk testing a morning that no longer felt like his own. He had been introduced to transport crates before, gently and without force, but always in controlled pieces, always on familiar ground. Today was different. Between the pen and the crate stretched a section of yard he had never crossed, packed dirt broken by fresh tire ruts, a strip of concrete warming in the sun, the bitter smell of engine oil, cut lumber, and drying paint drifting from a maintenance project near the sheds. Eli took the lead rope because his hands shook the least when he was scared. Hannah stood several paces off, reviewing the route in her head, even though she already knew every foot of it. Nora waited by the crate door with the latch ready. Claire had Benny on a loose lead near the fence, keeping him back for the moment, though the dog leaned forward as if he already understood this was not a morning for distance. Micah stepped out of the pen without resistance. That alone surprised everyone. He moved beside Eli for several yards, trunk sweeping low in a wide arc, reading the ground the way he always did when he was uncertain. But halfway across the lane, he stopped. His body went still from the shoulders down. The concrete patch ahead held heat differently. The air changed. Over it, sound bounced back too hard, too empty. It was new ground, and he knew it. Eli waited, giving the rope no pressure at all. "It's okay, buddy," he said softly, then hated the words as soon as they were out. Okay was a sighted word, a human word. It did nothing for the calf standing at the edge of what felt, to him, like a break in the world. Micah lifted his head, ears wide, and stood balanced between the memory of trust and the pull of old fear. A truck shifted gears near the outer fence. The low mechanical growl rolled across the yard and landed badly in Micah's chest. He rocked back one half step, not panicking, not yet, but close enough that Hannah saw the whole morning tilting toward failure. "Bring him," she said quietly. Claire did not need the instruction twice. She unclipped Benny's lead and walked him forward. The golden retriever moved into the lane with that same unhurried steadiness that had somehow, over the months, come to matter more than strategy. The bell rang once. Micah's ears snapped toward it before the sound had fully opened in the air. Then Benny passed him, and the bell rang again, heading straight toward the strange patch of ground. For a heartbeat, Micah remained frozen. The new smells were still there. The heat off the concrete still felt wrong. The crate still breathed metal and distance. But the bell had crossed first, and the thing attached to it had never once led him into harm. Benny reached the far side of the patch, paused, and looked back. The bell settled against his collar and gave one small answering note. Micah leaned forward. One step. The edge of the concrete met his foot. He stopped to think through it with his whole body. Then another step. The sound under him changed, flatter now, less forgiving. His trunk traced the surface in tight, careful passes. Benny moved again, slow enough to be followed, never far enough to become unreachable. Eli stayed beside the calf, silent now, humbled into letting the bell do what no person could. By the time Micah reached the crate ramp, everyone in the yard had gone still. The metal floor inside held a different scent entirely. Cooler, enclosed, touched by straw and old transport and the memory of other frightened animals. Benny placed his front paws onto the ramp first. The bell gave a light double ring as he climbed. Micah stood below, breathing hard, his trunk raised toward the doorway, searching the darkness beyond it for reasons to trust. Then Benny stepped inside. It was such a simple thing, one dog disappearing into shadow, but it changed the shape of the moment. The bell moved in the warm, dim interior and stopped. Micah listened. He had followed that sound across mud, open ground, storm fear, and the blind edges of his own uncertainty. Now it waited for him inside the dark. He lifted one foot onto the ramp, then another, and began to climb. The crate gave a hollow metallic echo under his weight. He hesitated at the threshold, half in light, half in shadow, trunk reaching ahead until it found Benny's shoulder, then the leather collar, then the little brass bell hanging still against warm fur. Only after that did he step fully inside. Nora closed the side gate with slow hands. Eli turned away for a second and pressed his wrist hard against his mouth. Before the main doors were shut, Claire called Benny softly back. The dog stood at the opening, then backed down the ramp one careful step at a time. As the bell moved away, Micah extended his trunk toward the narrowing band of daylight, following the retreating sound until his reach ended in empty air. The doors closed, metal caught, silence settled heavy and complete around the crate. The drive to Red Hollow took most of the afternoon. When the truck finally rolled through the conservancy gates, the air had changed. It smelled of dry grass, old stone, and elephants. Not one elephant, but many. Layered scent, deep and social, held low in the dust and the trees. When the crate doors opened, Micah did not rush out. He stood inside the dim interior, ears moving slowly, receiving a world that was larger than anything he had known. A woman waited at the bottom of the ramp. Lena Morales, the keeper assigned to his integration, said nothing at first. Around her neck hung a brass bell on a plain leather cord, matched as closely as Hannah had been able to manage from the ranch supplies. Not Benny's bell, not Benny's scent. Nothing false or sentimental. Just the same gentle register of sound, offered without demand. Lena turned and walked into the holding yard. The bell marked each step. Micah listened from the doorway, his body still taut with travel and newness. Then he lowered his trunk, found the ramp, and came forward into the late golden light of Red Hollow. He followed the sound across unfamiliar ground, each foot placed with care, each breath sorting the strange from the possible. Beyond the holding fence, deep in the distance, another bell answered, lower, older, carried by the movement of a mature female somewhere inside the herd. Weeks later, after the first supervised contact session, Micah would walk through an open gate toward that deeper bell and keep going until the herd took him in. But that belonged to another chapter of his life. Back at Blue Cedar, on the morning after the transport, the ranch woke to an empty pen, a quiet yard, and one dog who still arrived at 7:14 out of habit or hope or love. No one there could say which. That same week, a young gazelle came in from the reserve boundary, orphaned, skittish, and shaking at every human sound. They placed her in the smaller recovery enclosure near the east rail. The next morning, just after dawn, Benny nosed at the gate until Claire let him through. The bell rang once as he entered. In the corner, the little gazelle lifted her head and listened. If this story touched your heart, comment one below so I know Micah and Benny stayed with you. And if you believe even one small act of kindness can change a life, comment bell in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, because the next story might be the one you remember for a very long time.